Robert's words before he died. Giant hairy humanoids from the land, screaming, throwing rocks, kidnapping people, leaving home footprints, or simply hiding. These beasts are collectively known as Sasquatch, or whether they are a species of undiscovered apes or surviving prehistoric creatures. One thing is for sure, they don't like us, and if they aren't too busy avoiding detection, they will attack innocent people and damage property. We have exclusive information to share with you. Welcome to Wild Assault. Ronald and his father lived in the small village of Bethel, where most of the inhabitants made their living by hunting. They lived in a modest cabin on the outskirts of the village and went into the woods every day to hunt. Ronald's father was an accomplished hunter and passed on all his knowledge and skills to his son. Together they caught game, grew fruits and vegetables on their property, and lived modestly but happily. However, Ronald's life was not easy from the start. His mother died in childbirth and the boy had to grow up without her care. Despite this, Ronald's father tried to provide his son with everything he needed and give him a good education. Ronald quickly grew into a strong and skillful hunter and gradually got out from under his father's wing and began to hunt on his own. He became one of the best hunters in the village and was respected and loved by all the villagers. Life in the village was full of hardships, but Ronald and his father overcame all the difficulties together and remained inseparable partners in hunting for the rest of their lives. Ronald remembered his mother with love and gratitude for passing on to him the strength and endurance needed to survive in the harsh world of the wilderness. Ronald's father told stories about a mysterious creature that lived in the forest near the village. It was said of him that this beast was huge, with strong muscles, covered with thick fur, and had a human face. None of the villagers ever saw him in person, but they heard strange sounds from the forest and saw unusual tracks. Ronald's father used to tell him these stories before bedtime to urge his son to be careful and vigilant while hunting. He warned Ronald of the dangers that might be waiting for them in the woods and taught his son to be prepared for any contingency. Ronald listened attentively to his father's stories, and his imagination drew vivid images of the mysterious creature living in the forest. He felt that it was something unusual and mysterious and wished to see it with his own eyes. When times got bad, Ronald's father became very ill and needed expensive treatment. Ronald decided to take responsibility and started working even harder to earn the necessary money for his father's treatment. He gave up his own pleasures because taking care of his loved ones was the most important thing to him. Ronald started working late, sometimes even on weekends, to increase his income. He also looked for additional work and asked friends and acquaintances for help. Despite the difficulties, he did not give up and did not give up hope for his father's recovery. But unfortunately, he didn't manage to save his father from death. Ronald was in deep grief, having lost one of the closest people in his life. However, his example of love and devotion inspired many around him. Before he died, his father told Ronald a story about the hairy man in the woods, a story that is crazy scary, and Ronald was shocked. In 1945, Ronald's father, his name was Robert, went hunting in Alaska. Alaska is a very mysterious area full of wild beauty and amazing natural phenomena. Its taiga forests, icy mountains, volcanoes, glaciers, and crystal-clear lakes attract tourists and travelers from all over the world. This wild land is home to many different animals, from bears and whales to reindeer and eagles. You can also see the northern lights, a phenomenon that leaves a lasting impression. Alaska is truly one of the most amazing places on the planet. Robert, being an experienced hunter, was well aware of the importance of setting up his camp properly when hunting in Alaska. First, he chose the perfect place to set up camp, a small clearing in the forest near the lake where there was enough wood for a fire and enough water. He pitched his tent, which he secured with strong ropes, and unraveled it completely to create a comfortable space to rest and store his belongings. The first day, Robert could not find anything on the hunt. He went exploring in the woods, but was unable to find any sign of the wildlife he was looking for. Robert decided to return to his camp and spend the night in hopes that he would be able to find game in the morning. The next morning, Robert went hunting again, but even after many hours of searching, he still hadn't come across any animals. His frustration only grew because he realized that here in Alaska, where wildlife is so abundant, Not finding anything was a real setback, but on the third day he got lucky and was able to get on the trail of a bear. He followed it for a long time, about to make a lucky shot. When the bear finally stopped, Robert took aim and fired a shot. However, the shot was not too accurate, and the wounded bear fled into the woods. Robert followed him but lost the trail. He wandered around the woods all day but still couldn't find the wounded bear. By late afternoon, he returned to camp empty-handed, disappointed with his unsuccessful hunting day. When he got to camp, he hung his raincoat, a warm sweater on the branches. He cooked porridge over the fire in a cauldron, enjoying the serene peace and the beautiful weather. Waking up in the morning, Robert climbed out of the tent, stretched, and reached for his sweater, which he had hung on a branch before going to bed. But it wasn't there. His sweater was lying on the ground, crumpled up by someone, and the tins after the porridge were scattered. Albert thought it was his imagination because he was very tired. The next morning, Robert went out hunting, armed with his trusty rifle. He took his time and carefully hid behind the bushes so as not to excite the game. Finally, he noticed a small deer grazing slowly in the distance. Robert slowly approached the animal, chose the right moment, and fired. The shot rang out in the Alaskan silence, and the deer fell to the ground. Now, the hardest part of the hunt began, dragging the prey through the long bushes. Robert prepared a rope and fastened the deer to himself to make it easier to drag it along the ground. Each step was not easy as bushes and branches impeded his movement and scratched his hands and face. With each step, it seemed to him that the deer was getting heavier, but he kept moving forward, thinking of the fresh meat he would be able to cook. Finally, after much effort and sweat, Robert carried the deer to his camp. He was tired but happy. He had conquered nature and gotten a valuable prey. He lit a fire, hung the deer on a branch, and began to prepare supper. His fatigue was forgotten, and a sense of satisfaction filled his heart. Having eaten his supper, he went to bed. In the morning, he found his backpack turned inside out on a branch, all its contents lying under the tree. Most importantly, the deer carcass had disappeared from the tree. Clearly, it was not a groundhog that had visited his camp. Then who was it? But this animal could have done more damage than that. Robert looked for footprints, but found only indentations in the sand that looked like moccasin prints. Robert even thought it was the wounded bear Robert had shot. Waiting for the next night, Robert decided to track down the mysterious visitor. It got colder, the weather turned bad, hail fell. Fearing that the hail would damage his belongings, Robert stuffed not only his boots but also his backpack and supplies, as well as his rifle and knife, into the tent. As soon as he felt warm in the tent, he fell asleep. But suddenly he was awakened by a quiet rustle. Robert sat on his bed and listened to the sounds of the night. He heard footsteps outside his tent and realized that it was not an animal, but a man. Robert quickly grabbed his gun and waited for the intruder to come closer. When a shadow flashed near the entrance to the tent, Robert jumped outside and pointed the barrel of his gun toward the intruder. Robert was scared out of his wits when the intruder began hissing and making scary noises. The sounds were like long, hoarse cries filled with ominous notes of menace. The creature's eyes were full of rage and aggression, and its ravenous gaze made Robert shiver with fear. However, Robert was determined and was not going to remain helpless in the face of danger. With confidence, he kept the gun pointed at the intruder, ready to defend his life and his camp at all costs. But suddenly, Robert was struck from behind. Waking up, Robert felt a sharp pain in his head as he remembered that he had been attacked by a stranger. He looked around and realized that he was bound and wrapped in a sleeping bag. He felt cramped and stuffy, but there was nothing he could do about it. The creature that had attacked him stood nearby, studying him with curiosity. It was a man with a wild, puzzled look and long hair covered in dirt and soot. He didn't look like a normal forest dweller. His appearance caused Robert to feel bewilderment and fear. The creature came closer and began to speak in a strange language that Robert couldn't understand. Then it took him by the hair and slammed his head sharply against the wall, causing him sharp pain and unconsciousness for a moment. When Robert woke up, he realized he was still being held captive by the stranger. He tried to free himself, but the ropes were too tight and his attacking creature was too strong. He felt fear and helplessness, not knowing what would happen next. The stranger began rummaging through Robert's bag, pulling out his personal belongings. Robert realized that this situation was becoming increasingly dangerous and he had to act quickly. But he was unarmed and weakened from the attack. "What the hell do you guys want me for?" he said, the first thing that came to mind. Some mumbling came in response. So far, he had not been touched, and Robert eyed the creatures that stood beside him. It was clearly a family of wild men. They were all covered in hair, were unclothed, and resembled huge monkeys. No doubt he had been dragged here by his master, an adult male between 9 and 11 feet tall. As the sun rose, the hairy creatures moved away, leaving Albert alone. He looked around. There were sheer cliffs all around. Only in one place was a small V-shaped passage that led somewhere upward. Robert realized that he had to find a way out of this situation. He began to think of ways to use his intelligence and wit to defeat his enemy. For even in such a hopeless situation, he did not give up or lose hope. He began to look around the surrounding area, looking for a way to escape. He managed to find a sharp rock which he used to cut the ropes binding him. Robert carefully released his hands and feet without making too much noise. Then he resolutely headed towards the exit of this cave, confident that he could get out of this nightmare. On his way out of the cave, he saw another hairy creature standing at the entrance, blocking his way. Robert froze, not knowing what to do next. He decided to pass by as if he lived there. Seeing this, the creature only frowned and began to approach him, preparing for another attack. Robert was ready to fight. He clutched a sharp stone in his hand, but in a moment he realized that he would not be able to resist it, and he fell to his knees. The creature grabbed Robert by the hair with such force that his head felt as if it had been torn from his torso. He screamed in pain as he was dragged deeper into the cave, his screams only getting louder and more frightening. The creature kept growling and hissing, making noises filled with rage and aggression. Robert realized that something terrible awaited him and tried to resist, but his strength ran out from pain and fear. The creature led him to a dark corner of the cave where he was thrown to the ground. He lay there breathless and helpless, realizing that he had no way of escape. He was a prisoner of this savage and ruthless creature that revealed to him the hellish reality of his nightmare. On the third day, Robert felt very hungry. His stomach was empty and inside everything was screaming for food. The piece of raw meat thrown to him by the creature was his only chance of survival. He looked at it in disgust, but realized he needed something to eat to keep his strength up. Robert rose to his knees, reached out and picked up a piece of meat. He tasted it and smelled the disgusting taste and odor of raw meat. But he swallowed it, realizing it was his only chance of survival. The creature watched him as he ate, making strange noises and hissing at him. Robert could feel its gaze on him, its intimidating power and aggression. He knew he had no choice but to submit to the creature. After eating, Robert was left lying on the floor, feeling weak and defenseless. He became imbued with despair and fear, realizing what awaited him next. But he still didn't give up, kept the hope of salvation alive, even if it seemed impossible. 4 days later, Robert was tied to a pole with rope and kneeling on his knees, his hands tied behind him. He was very hungry, but he could not move and had to eat whatever the creatures threw at him. When the hairy creature led him to the berry bushes, he looked at them as if they were a whole world of tastes and smells he had not experienced in so long. The creature began to hiss and jostle him, pointing at the berries and motioning him towards them. He carefully took a berry in his hand and sniffed it. A fresh and sweet aroma filled his nostrils. He slowly began to chew the berry. The berries were sweet and juicy, and Robert could feel the energy returning to his body, giving him strength and hope. He ate a few more berries. The creature stared at him intently, gauging his reaction. Robert looked up and saw a strange expression in his eyes, something like sympathy. In that moment, he felt that perhaps there was a connection between them, a thin thread that could change his fate. But suddenly the creature growled and pushed him back to the bushes, showing him that the time had come and it was time for him to go back to the cave. Robert realized that this moment of mercy was only a brief moment in their ruthless game. He was forced to turn and walk back, but there was a spark of hope in his heart, hope that one day he might be free and regain his freedom. During the time Robert had been in captivity, he had seen 4 creatures, 2 males and 2 females. The first creature was a male, his fur thick and covered in warts. He was tall and powerful, with strong muscles that made him look intimidating. His eyes were red and glittering with rage, and his fangs were sharp and long. He was the leader of this group of creatures, his presence striking fear into everyone around him. The second creature was a female. She was slightly smaller than the male, but she was also strong and formidable. Her fur was shorter and had a grayish tint to it. She had large, sharp claws and large teeth. Her eyes were cunning and intelligent. She was always at the male's side, ready to do his bidding. The third creature was another male. He was smaller than the first, but no less dangerous. It had a long neck and a head that resembled a predator. Its skin was covered in silky fur that was a mixture of dark and light stripes. It was fast and agile, always ready for action. The fourth creature was a female. She was the youngest and most playful of all. Its fur was soft and fluffy and had a silvery tint to it. It had large sparkling eyes that sparkled with joy and curiosity. It was gentler and softer than the others, often showing concern for Robert, trying to help him in times of need. That's the end of the story. As Robert was telling this story, he began to feel worse. Ronald called for help in the room and was no longer interested in the story. Ronald felt mixed feelings as he listened to his father's story before his death. He felt sadness and sorrow to see his father suffer and die. But he listened intently to his father's words, absorbed in the story of a wild adventure in the woods many years ago. Ronald felt fear and anxiety as he imagined the horrible events described by his father. He was terrified to imagine that his father could have survived such a terrible ordeal in the Alaskan forest.